The facade of fairness in our society is nothing but a sham. Behind the polished veneer of justice lies a system that systematically crushes the voices of the vulnerable and upholds the interests of the corrupt. Every day, the oppressed are trampled by those who claim to protect us, and the blood of our collective indignation demands accountability. How much longer will we stand by and let this betrayal continue? In the heart of Riverton, where towering glass buildings shimmered in the early morning light and the gentle hum of life stirred the quiet streets, Ariana Blackwell stepped out of an upscale boutique. The city, known for its relentless pace and unyielding ambition, wore a contrasting mask that morning, one of promise interwoven with an undercurrent of silent tension. Riverton was a place where power and privilege often danced a delicate ballet, and where those who dared to challenge the established order risked everything. Ariana, a formidable attorney at one of the city's most renowned law firms, was no stranger to the demands of her world. Every day, she navigated the labyrinth of legal battles, courtroom dramas, and whispered biases that questioned her very presence in spaces dominated by tradition and male authority. But that morning, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she had set aside the weight of her professional armor. Clad in a soft emerald dress that caught the glimmer of the rising sun, Ariana's eyes sparkled with a quiet determination and an air of vulnerable hope. The dress, flowing gracefully around her legs, was more than a garment, it was a testament to her hard-fought victories and the promise of a personal reprieve from the relentless demands of her career. The boutique she had just left, Elysian, was a sanctuary of elegance, where every piece of fabric and each carefully curated accessory whispered stories of refinement and aspiration. Today, however, the world outside was not so kind. As Ariana took her first steps onto the sunlit sidewalk, the city's beauty and brutality converged in an uneasy duet. The warm, golden light bathed the street, casting elongated shadows beneath the stately palms that lined the avenue. Yet, beneath this picturesque scene, a storm of injustice was gathering force. Without warning, two figures emerged from the crowd, a pair of uniformed officers from Riverton's police department, known by many for their unchecked arrogance and an air of entitlement that seemed to shield them from reproach. Their names were Officer Larson and Officer Briggs. With their crisp uniforms and practiced smiles that rarely masked malice, they had earned a notorious reputation in certain circles. For years, their actions had blurred the lines between duty and abuse, leaving scars on the fabric of the community. Today, their target was clear, Ariana Blackwell. The encounter began almost imperceptibly. As Ariana strolled along the busy thoroughfare, her mind lightly wandering through memories of previous successes, she failed to notice the subtle yet chilling exchange of glances between the two officers. There was a spark, a silent acknowledgement of opportunity. Larson, with a self-assured smirk, broke the comfortable cadence of the morning with a greeting that dripped with condescension. His tone was deceptively polite, yet every word carried a hidden weight, a suggestion that she did not belong in this part of the city. Ariana paused, momentarily thrown off by the unexpected interruption. Her eyes met Larson's, and in that fleeting moment, an unspoken challenge was issued. But her response was measured and composed. After all, she was accustomed to being scrutinized, misunderstood, and even underestimated. She offered a polite nod, hoping that her calm demeanor might diffuse the tension. Unfortunately, Larson's smirk deepened, and his partner, Officer Briggs, joined him with an equally disconcerting air of entitlement. "What brings you to this part of town today, Miss Blackwell?" Larson inquired, his voice laced with a patronizing curiosity as his eyes casually scanned the designer shopping bag clutched in her hand. There was an implication, a subtle insinuation that she was out of place in this affluent yet rigorously segregated quarter of Riverton. The question was innocent on its surface, but to Ariana, it reeked of discrimination. She took a deep breath, recalling the countless times she had had to prove her worth in boardrooms and courtrooms alike. Today, she simply wanted to enjoy a rare moment of personal freedom. "I've just finished a little shopping," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the rising storm within her. Yet, the officers' smiles widened as if they had anticipated her answer, confirming their own biased assumptions. The pleasant morning began to sour with every passing second. As Ariana continued her walk, the officer's presence grew increasingly intrusive. Larson's eyes followed her like a predator tracking its prey. His words, seemingly casual, became increasingly charged with implications. "Not many folks leave Elysian with that kind of bag in this neighborhood," he commented, his tone suggesting that her appearance, her wealth, and her very presence were markers of suspicion. Ariana felt a chill run down her spine. This was no ordinary encounter, it was a deliberate act of intimidation, a show of power by those who believed their badge made them untouchable. The serenity of the morning was abruptly shattered, and with it, a sense of foreboding began to seep into every fiber of her being. She had faced many challenges in her life, but the casual brutality of authority, executed with such brazen confidence, was a wound that cut deep. For a brief moment, Ariana considered the silent implications of their behavior, the way in which they used their position to undermine her identity, to question her legitimacy. But she also knew that today was not a day to be defeated by fear. With her head held high, she continued down the street, every step a silent protest against the systemic injustice that had plagued her for far too long. In the midst of this charged atmosphere, the city around her carried on obliviously. Pedestrians, lost in their own worlds, passed by without noticing the microcosm of conflict unfolding on the sidewalk. The air was heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine from a nearby park, and the distant sound of a street musician strumming a soulful melody on his guitar added an almost surreal quality to the scene. It was as if Riverton itself was caught between beauty and brutality, where every bright ray of sunshine concealed the dark shadows of prejudice and abuse. Ariana's mind raced with memories of past battles, courtroom victories that had redefined her career, moments of silent defiance where she had refused to let injustice dictate the course of her life. Yet, today, the stakes felt deeply personal. The encounter with Larson and Briggs was not merely an inconvenience, it was a challenge to her very existence as a successful, independent black woman in a city that often conflated her achievements with audacity. As she walked, the internal monologue of her heart and mind interwove with the external chaos. The taste of sweet coffee from a morning meeting, the subtle hum of conversation in the boutique, and the distant chatter of colleagues at a nearby cafe all contrasted sharply with the rising tension. Every detail of her surroundings, the glistening windows of the high-rise offices, the vibrant murals adorning the street walls, even the rhythmic pulse of the city, served as a reminder of both the promise and peril of life in Riverton. In that moment, Ariana realized that her struggle was not hers alone. It was the struggle of countless individuals who had been marginalized, silenced, or dismissed by an authority that operated with impunity. Her every step became an act of rebellion, a quiet assertion of her dignity in the face of an oppressive system. The emotional storm within her gathered strength, fueled by memories of injustices suffered by herself and by those whose voices had been stifled by a society too eager to accept a narrative of power without accountability. Yet, as much as the moment was charged with defiance, it was also imbued with a deep, aching sadness. Ariana couldn't help but feel the weight of history on her shoulders, the cumulative scars of a community that had long endured discrimination and violence at the hands of those sworn to protect. In her heart, she harbored a quiet promise: she would not be broken by this encounter, no matter how harsh or degrading it might become. Her resolve was a flame, flickering but unextinguished, burning steadily against the cold winds of injustice. The soft rustle of fabric, the echo of distant footsteps, and the palpable intensity of the moment coalesced into a singular truth: today marked the beginning of a new chapter. For Ariana Blackwell, the world was about to change, and with every step she took, she carried the hopes of a community yearning for justice, respect, and recognition. In the face of blatant discrimination and the arrogant display of power, she chose to remain unbowed. Her determination was not just for herself, it was a beacon for all those who had ever felt diminished by a system that refused to acknowledge their worth. And so, beneath the brilliant light of a Riverton sunrise that seemed to promise both hope and hardship in equal measure, Ariana stepped forward, an embodiment of resilience, grace, and quiet rebellion. The day was just beginning, and though shadows of injustice loomed large, the spark of change had been ignited. What do you think will happen next as Ariana faces this challenge? Ariana Blackwell's determined stride was interrupted by the relentless approach of officers Larson and Briggs. The calm facade that had characterized her morning was now starting to fracture under the pressure of invasive authority. The golden sunlight, which had once bathed the streets of Riverton in promise, now seemed to cast long, accusatory shadows behind the two officers. As she continued walking, her senses heightened, Ariana could feel the weight of every eye in the vicinity, even those of strangers who barely noticed the unfolding drama. Larson, with his face set in a patronizing smile, moved closer, his tone now edged with barely concealed hostility. "Miss Blackwell," he began, his voice smooth but laced with threat, "we need to have a word with you. It's not every day we see someone of your caliber walking these parts without a proper introduction." His words, seemingly benign, carried a charge that made Ariana's heart beat faster. Ariana's pulse quickened as she slowed her pace, but she did not stop. In her mind, she recalled the many times she had been underestimated, each moment strengthening her resolve to stand firm against injustice. She replied, her voice calm yet resolute, "I'm simply on my way home. I have nothing to hide." Her words were firm, echoing a lifetime of battles fought in boardrooms and courtrooms alike. Briggs, standing slightly to the side, maintained an inscrutable expression, his eyes cold and calculating. For him, this was not just about routine questioning, it was an opportunity to assert a power he believed was inherent in his uniform. "We've been informed that there's been suspicious activity in the area," he said, his gaze flicking to the designer shopping bag in Ariana's hand. "It's our duty to ensure the safety of all citizens." The statement was presented as a matter of fact, but its implications were clear: anyone who did not conform to their narrow expectations was a threat. Ariana's mind raced. Each syllable from the officers resonated with a familiar echo of bias and discrimination. The subtle insinuations that she was an anomaly in this affluent part of Riverton stung deeply. She knew her rights, she was not a suspect, nor was she a threat. Yet, the officers' probing eyes and the oppressive aura of their presence made it painfully clear that, in their view, her very existence was a challenge to the status quo. Taking a deep breath, Ariana tried once more to defuse the situation with measured politeness. "Officers, I assure you I have done nothing wrong. I only spent a little on some clothes at Elysian this morning. I'm perfectly within my rights to be here." Her tone was respectful but firm, every word weighed down with the gravity of countless encounters with prejudice. Larson stepped even closer, invading the small space around her. His presence was overwhelming, as if his very proximity was meant to intimidate. "I'm afraid we can't just take your word for it," he said, his smile now thin and predatory. "There are protocols we follow. Please, hand over your shopping bag so we can verify your purchase." His request was absurdly invasive, a demand that implied guilt by association rather than any actual evidence. Ariana's eyes widened in disbelief. This was a line she had encountered before, a line drawn by those who believed that wearing a label of success somehow granted permission to strip away her dignity. "I don't see how my bag or its contents have any bearing on what I've done," she responded, her voice firm despite the trembling that threatened to betray her inner turmoil. The street around them had begun to buzz with the murmur of onlookers. Some walked briskly past, unwilling to get involved, others paused, their faces etched with empathy and concern. The air was thick with anticipation, a moment when the quiet beauty of Riverton was marred by the raw tension of authority and defiance. Briggs, who had until now maintained an impassive demeanor, now exchanged a brief, conspiratorial glance with Larson. It was as if the two shared an unspoken agreement, a pact to assert control at any cost. "Miss Blackwell, if you refuse, then we may have to take further action," Larson warned, his tone softening into a deceptive calm that barely concealed the threat beneath. In that critical moment, Ariana's inner strength flared. Memories of every injustice, every dismissive look, and every demeaning encounter surged within her. She recalled the countless nights spent researching legal precedents, preparing herself for the inevitable moments when the system would seek to undermine her. The courage that had carried her through courtroom battles now shone in her eyes. "I will not be intimidated," she declared, her voice steady and clear. "I know my rights, and I have nothing to hide." Her words, imbued with both defiance and vulnerability, cut through the stifling tension like a clarion call for justice. A murmur ran through the crowd as the officers hesitated, caught off guard by the unyielding resolve in her voice. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if the very air vibrated with the intensity of her declaration. Yet, the sense of hope was tempered by the reality that this confrontation was only the beginning, a spark that would soon ignite a larger struggle against an oppressive system. Larson's eyes narrowed as he attempted to regain control of the situation. "This isn't about intimidation, Miss Blackwell," he insisted, his voice low and menacing. "It's about maintaining order and ensuring that everyone plays by the rules." His words, though couched in the language of duty, were a thin veil for the cruelty that lay beneath. Ariana's heart pounded as she stepped back, not out of fear, but as a physical manifestation of the emotional toll the encounter was exacting. The bustling street seemed to close in around her, the familiar sights and sounds now tinted with a grim sense of foreboding. The shimmering storefronts and the gentle rustling of the city's life now provided the backdrop for a drama that was all too real, a drama where power and prejudice clashed with the indomitable spirit of an individual determined to stand up for herself. As the minutes stretched on, the confrontation took on a more charged tone. Officers Larson and Briggs exchanged a few terse words, their eyes darting between Ariana and the growing assembly of curious bystanders. The subtle dance of authority and resistance played out on that sunlit street, each movement a microcosm of a broader societal struggle. To some, it was merely an inconvenient disturbance, to others, it was a poignant reminder of the challenges that lay in the path of true equality. Ariana's mind, though heavy with the burden of past experiences, began to formulate her next steps. She knew that this moment, fraught with tension and the potential for escalation, could not be allowed to spiral out of control. In her heart, a silent promise was made, a vow that she would not let this encounter define her, nor would she let it diminish the spirit of justice that had always guided her path. The officer's presence, the unwelcome probing, and the subtle insinuations of guilt were all part of a pattern that had repeated too many times in the lives of those who dared to challenge the narrative of authority. Ariana felt the weight of that history, a history of quiet suffering, of voices silenced and dismissed. Yet, in her eyes burned a fierce determination to reclaim her narrative, to assert her worth in a society that too often relegated her to the shadows. At that moment, a distant sound of approaching sirens and the murmur of an anxious crowd provided a backdrop to the standoff. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move in this unfolding drama. For Ariana, the encounter was more than a personal affront, it was a call to arms, a reminder that the fight against systemic injustice was far from over. As she stood her ground, Ariana's thoughts turned to the broader implications of this confrontation. This was not simply about her, it was about every individual who had ever felt the sting of discrimination, every soul who had been deemed unworthy by those in power. With each breath, she embodied the collective courage of a community that refused to be silenced. Her eyes, bright with unyielding defiance, scanned the crowd, not in search of sympathy, but of silent solidarity. Somewhere among them, she knew, were those who had also borne the brunt of a system built on bias. The tension in the air was palpable, and the moment seemed to stretch on interminably. Officer Larson's hand hovered near his utility belt, a subtle reminder of the power he wielded and the danger it posed. Yet, as he advanced, the crowd's murmur grew louder, a cacophony of discontent that began to seep into the fabric of the confrontation. It was as if the very spirit of Riverton was rising in collective defiance, challenging the notion that authority could trample over the dignity of an individual without consequence. In that charged atmosphere, Ariana took a step forward. Her voice, though soft, resonated with an almost musical quality. "I stand here not as a target, but as a testament to the strength of every person who has ever been judged unfairly. I stand for justice, for truth, and for a future where respect is not a privilege, but a right." Her declaration, filled with both sorrow and hope, seemed to electrify the air around her. For a moment, time appeared to slow. The officers, the bystanders, and even the city itself were caught in a delicate pause, a fragile balance between oppression and the potential for change. In that brief silence, Ariana's words became a beacon of possibility, an affirmation that the struggle for dignity was a battle worth fighting, regardless of the personal cost. What do you think Ariana's next move will be as the tension escalates further? Just as the atmosphere on the sunlit street of Riverton seemed to teeter on the brink of confrontation, a sudden shift in the air heralded the arrival of someone who would change the course of events. Out of the growing throng of onlookers and murmurs of discontent, a figure emerged, a man whose presence was both commanding and quietly resolute. His name was Elias Blackwell, Ariana's husband, and in that moment, his arrival brought with it the promise of intervention and a spark of renewed hope. Elias had been on his way from an early morning training session at a local community center, a modest facility dedicated to empowering youth through sports and education, when he noticed the crowd gathering near the upscale district. His heart pounded with an anxious rhythm as he navigated through the assembly of curious onlookers. The sight of his wife, Ariana, standing tall yet encircled by officers Larson and Briggs, was a sight he had dreaded. But as he drew closer, determination lit his eyes, fueled by years of shared battles and an unwavering commitment to protect the ones he loved. As Elias reached the scene, the tension was palpable. The officers, still entrenched in their routine of intimidation, had begun to encroach further upon Ariana's personal space. Larson's predatory smile faltered for an instant when he caught sight of Elias striding toward them, his gait firm and purposeful. The crowd fell into a hushed silence, the murmurs of dissent growing louder as Elias positioned himself between Ariana and the officers. "Step aside," Elias said, his voice low but resonant with authority. His words were not a threat but a declaration, a call for decency and respect that reverberated through the silent witnesses on the sidewalk. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their confident facades wavering under the weight of Elias's presence. Larson, attempting to salvage his control over the situation, stepped forward with an air of forced composure. "Sir, this is a routine inquiry. There's no need for interference," he asserted, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. Elias's eyes, however, burned with an intensity that left no room for ambiguity. "I'm not here to create trouble, but I won't stand by while my wife is treated like a criminal," he replied, his tone both calm and unyielding. The crowd, sensing a turning tide, began to rally in silent support. Faces turned from sympathetic to defiant as a growing number of onlookers recognized the injustice unfolding before them. Elias's intervention had transformed the encounter from an isolated act of harassment into a symbol of resistance against abuse of power. His every step exuded not just the physical strength of a man who had trained relentlessly, but also the emotional fortitude born from a lifetime of witnessing and combating systemic injustice. Ariana, who had stood resolute in the face of relentless scrutiny moments before, now felt a surge of relief and empowerment at her husband's arrival. Her eyes met Elias's in a silent exchange, a communication filled with mutual understanding and the shared weight of past battles. Together, they formed a united front, a testament to the strength that comes from love, solidarity, and the unbreakable bond forged through adversity. Officer Briggs, sensing the shift in dynamics, hesitated before speaking. "Sir, we're simply following protocol," he murmured, though his tone no longer conveyed the assuredness it once had. Elias's response was firm and unyielding. "Protocols must never come at the expense of a person's dignity or rights. I expect you to treat my wife with the respect she deserves," he stated, his voice echoing with the conviction of someone who had fought many battles on and off the field. For a moment, the tension held, a fragile equilibrium between the oppressive might of authority and the resilient spirit of those determined to reclaim justice. Elias stepped even closer, his eyes scanning the faces of the onlookers, silently inviting them to bear witness to this confrontation. The air was thick with anticipation, every heartbeat resonating with the promise of change. In that charged space, the actions of two individuals, Ariana and Elias Blackwell, had ignited a spark that reached far beyond the confines of a single street in Riverton. As Elias's intervention gained momentum, a subtle yet unmistakable shift began to ripple through the crowd. People who had huddled in the background now stepped forward, some recording the moment with their phones, others simply watching with expressions that combined fear, hope, and determination. A few voices broke the silence, murmuring words of encouragement to Ariana and Elias, reinforcing the idea that this confrontation was not merely a personal struggle but a collective fight against a system steeped in injustice. Meanwhile, the officers found themselves at a crossroads. Larson's earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by a defensive posture that spoke of uncertainty. His hand, which had lingered near his utility belt with an air of menace, slowly retreated as Elias's unwavering stance began to undermine the authority he once wielded without question. The smile that had once been so calculating on Larson's face now appeared forced, as if he were grappling with an unfamiliar sensation, vulnerability. In the midst of this internal conflict, Officer Briggs, who had been silently assessing the situation, took a cautious step back. His eyes flickered with a hint of resignation as he realized that the balance of power was shifting in real time. "We're not trying to cause any trouble here," he said softly, almost to himself, as though seeking solace in his own words. But the murmurs from the gathering crowd made it clear that the moment had evolved into something far greater than a routine interaction. Elias, ever aware of the broader implications, addressed the officers once more. "I understand that you have a job to do, but let me remind you that every citizen here has the right to be treated with fairness and dignity. If you continue to harass my wife under the guise of protocol, you will have not only me but this community to answer to." His voice, imbued with both the calm of a seasoned advocate and the fierce determination of a protector, left no room for misunderstanding. At that moment, the sound of distant sirens began to swell, a reminder that the machinery of authority was always ready to mobilize. Yet, even as the sirens grew louder, the crowd's energy did not wane, rather, it transformed into an unmistakable declaration of solidarity. People whispered among themselves, and some even began to take to social media, posting snapshots and videos with hashtags that signaled a turning point in the struggle against police overreach. Ariana's heart swelled with pride and relief as she watched Elias, the man she loved, standing fearless against the tide of injustice. In the briefest of instants, the encounter had metamorphosed from a scene of intimidation into a public display of courage, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt oppressed by an unyielding system. The officers, now caught in the glare of public scrutiny, seemed to realize that their actions were no longer hidden in the shadows of unchecked authority. Instead, they were exposed to the collective gaze of a community that demanded accountability. The confrontation, though far from over, had reached a turning point. Elias's steadfast presence and the unwavering support of the crowd had disarmed the situation in a way that protocol and coercion never could. The sun, still climbing higher in the Riverton sky, cast its light over the scene, symbolically illuminating the truth that had been concealed for too long. In that pivotal moment, as the murmurs of the crowd grew louder and the officers began to retreat under the pressure of public scrutiny, Ariana felt a surge of determination. She knew that this was just the beginning, a single confrontation that could ripple outward to challenge the broader injustices embedded in the system. With Elias by her side, she felt invincible, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Her gaze, once shadowed by uncertainty, now shone with the radiance of defiance and hope. The confrontation had not ended with the exchange of words alone, it had set in motion a series of events that would soon transform Riverton. The actions of that morning would ripple through the city, inspiring others to speak out, to record, and to stand up against the abuse of power. It was a call to arms for every citizen who had ever felt marginalized or silenced, a call that resonated with the unyielding belief that truth, when seen by all, could no longer be obscured by lies or manipulated by those in authority. As the officers, now visibly unsettled, began to withdraw, Elias turned to Ariana, his eyes softening with a mixture of relief and tenderness. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from her face. Her smile, though weary from the ordeal, conveyed gratitude and an unspoken promise that together they would weather the storm. In the background, the city of Riverton buzzed with renewed energy. The incident, now unfolding in real time before a captivated audience, was already beginning to trend online, its raw authenticity cutting through the usual filters of curated narratives. The community's response was swift and passionate. Social media posts, impassioned speeches, and public demonstrations began to take shape, all calling for accountability and justice. It was clear that the actions of officers Larson and Briggs would not be allowed to pass unnoticed or unchallenged. Ariana and Elias, standing side by side, knew that their personal struggle was intertwined with a larger battle for equality and respect. Their encounter had become a symbol, a rallying cry for those who believed that dignity and justice were not privileges to be granted by authority, but rights to be fiercely defended by every citizen. What new challenges do you think will arise from this act of defiance, and how might the community respond in the days to come? In the wake of the confrontation on that Riverton street, the atmosphere shifted from one of isolated defiance to a collective uprising of voices determined to expose the truth. As officers Larson and Briggs retreated under the weight of public scrutiny, a palpable sense of urgency swept through the crowd. The encounter had ignited not just anger, but also a fervent resolve to document every moment and to hold those in power accountable. This was the beginning of a movement, a spark that would soon set ablaze a quest for truth and justice. The air vibrated with a mixture of adrenaline and anticipation as bystanders, many of whom had silently borne witness to similar injustices before, pulled out their phones and began recording. The raw footage captured not only the unmistakable tension of the encounter but also the emotions that permeated every face in the gathering. Strangers exchanged knowing glances, some whispered words of support while others offered quiet nods of solidarity. Each recording, each shared image, was a small act of resistance, a testament that the community would not allow the abuse of power to remain hidden. Among those recording was Maya Carter, a local journalist known for her unwavering commitment to shining a light on the dark corners of Riverton's power structures. Maya's hands trembled with both excitement and concern as she ensured that every detail was documented. She had spent years following the whispers of injustice in her city, and today, she felt the weight of history in every captured frame. With a determined expression, Maya whispered to herself, "This is our chance to set the record straight." Meanwhile, in a nearby cafe that had quickly become an impromptu command center, a group of community activists huddled together. They had arrived on the scene even before the confrontation escalated, armed with cameras, notepads, and an unyielding belief that the truth had to be uncovered. Among them was Jamal, a tech-savvy organizer whose keen eye for detail had already begun to piece together a timeline of the events. Jamal's fingers danced rapidly over his tablet, syncing live footage with social media updates and coordinating with activists in different parts of the city. The digital pulse of Riverton was quickening, and every shared moment added fuel to the growing fire of resistance. Back on the street, as the officers withdrew, whispers of dissent turned into resolute declarations. A young woman, her voice firm despite evident fear, stood atop a low wall to address the onlookers. "We will not be silenced," she proclaimed, her voice echoing off the buildings that bore witness to decades of inequity. The crowd responded with cheers and claps, a spontaneous outpouring of unity that resonated with every soul present. It was clear that this was not an isolated incident but a tipping point in the long struggle against systemic abuse. For Ariana, the emotional toll of the day was beginning to crystallize into a newfound clarity. Though the initial shock and fear had threatened to overwhelm her, the solidarity of her community and the resolute determination in Elias's eyes lent her strength. She sensed that this moment was bigger than her personal battle. It was the unmasking of a system built on lies and a call to action for all who had suffered under its yoke. With each breath, she felt her resolve harden. She knew that every documented moment, every shared frame, was a building block in a case that would eventually force the truth into the light. As the crowd dispersed slowly, some heading home with quiet smiles of defiance and others continuing to linger in hushed discussion, Maya approached Ariana and Elias. With a notepad clutched tightly in her hand, Maya's eyes burned with the passion of a storyteller determined to capture every nuance of the day's events. "Your courage today," she said softly, "has given us the evidence we need. The world will see what happened here. This is not just your story, it's the story of every person who has been wronged." Her words, simple yet powerful, reaffirmed that the battle for truth was a shared journey. Elias, still standing protectively by Ariana's side, nodded in quiet agreement. "We've only just begun," he replied, his voice steady. "But we won't let them bury the truth again." His tone carried the weight of hard-won battles from years past, a promise that the struggle for justice was not a solitary fight but one that the entire community would shoulder together. As dusk began to settle over Riverton, the digital reverberations of the day's events grew louder. Social media feeds lit up with hashtags such as #RivertonTruth and #StandForJustice. The raw footage and testimonies from bystanders began circulating widely, each clip serving as a counternarrative to the sanitized versions often fed to the public by those in power. News outlets that had once hesitated to tackle stories of police overreach now scrambled to piece together the comprehensive account emerging from the streets. The evidence was undeniable, its authenticity confirmed by countless independent sources and the unyielding persistence of community activists. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the city's neon lights flickered to life against the darkening sky, Ariana retreated to a modest apartment that had long been her sanctuary. The apartment was small but filled with mementos of her journey, framed photographs of past victories, shelves lined with legal tomes, and a window that overlooked a bustling street now bathed in a resolute glow. In that space, she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, a brief pause to process the emotional torrent of the day. The scars of discrimination and the pain of past injustices still lingered, but so did the promise of change. Elias joined her shortly after, the quiet murmur of his footsteps a comforting presence. Sitting side by side on a worn sofa, they reviewed the day's recordings together. Elias's hand reached out to gently cover hers, a silent reaffirmation of their unbreakable bond. "We've done well today," he said softly. "But we need to be prepared, this is just the beginning. They'll try to discredit us, to twist what happened into something unrecognizable." His eyes, though filled with determination, also betrayed a hint of worry. The struggle for truth was rarely easy, and the road ahead promised challenges that could test even the strongest of wills. Ariana met his gaze with a steely resolve. "Let them try," she whispered. "Our truth is louder than their lies. Every recorded moment, every shared story, this evidence will pave the way for change." The quiet conviction in her voice resonated deeply, echoing the unspoken promise that as long as voices were raised and cameras kept rolling, the forces of oppression could not silence them forever. Across the city, in cramped offices and bustling community centers, similar conversations were taking place. Activists, legal experts, and everyday citizens, each stirred by the events on that Riverton street, commenced plans to further the investigation. Meetings were set up, hotlines established, and legal strategies discussed with meticulous care. The community was no longer content to be passive witnesses, they were emerging as active participants in the fight for justice, united by the shared belief that the truth must prevail over the oppressive narratives perpetuated by those in power. In the coming days, as the digital storm continued to gather momentum and more evidence surfaced, whispers of accountability began to ripple through Riverton. The relentless pursuit of truth by Maya, Jamal, and countless others signaled that the system could no longer operate in the shadows of unchecked authority. Every tweet, every shared video clip, was a beacon of hope, a tangible demonstration that the people were ready to reclaim their rights and demand transparency. Yet, even amidst the rising optimism, a sense of caution lingered. The power structures that had long thrived on silence and manipulation were formidable, and those who dared challenge them often faced retaliation. For Ariana and Elias, the knowledge that their lives were now intertwined with a larger movement came with the sobering realization that the coming days might bring threats, both subtle and overt. But the resolve that had been forged in the heat of confrontation was unyielding. They had already glimpsed the transformative power of collective action, and that flame would not be easily extinguished. As the night deepened and Riverton streets grew quieter, the city seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the next chapter, a chapter that promised further revelations, more courageous stands, and a relentless quest to dismantle a legacy of injustice. In that suspended moment between darkness and dawn, every soul that had witnessed the day's events silently vowed to keep fighting, to record, and to demand accountability. Their voices, once muted by fear and oppression, were now rising in a chorus of defiance that would echo far beyond the boundaries of Riverton. How do you think the community and the activists will navigate the challenges ahead as they work to expose the deeper truths behind this incident? In the days that followed the stirring events on Riverton streets, a palpable urgency gripped the city. The incident had sparked a relentless drive among community activists, journalists, and even ordinary citizens who were determined to see justice done. Evidence gathered from the confrontation, the raw videos, testimonies, and digital footprints, began circulating widely, dismantling the sanitized narratives that had long cloaked police misconduct. As the digital storm intensified, the gears of accountability slowly started to turn. At the heart of this uprising was Maya Carter, whose recordings and incisive reporting had become a beacon for truth. Working tirelessly from her modest office, Maya compiled every piece of evidence, cross-referencing timestamps, and interviewing eyewitnesses. Her determination was matched only by the mounting pressure from those in power, who sought to discredit her findings and label the recordings as incomplete or misleading. Yet, Maya remained resolute, knowing that every frame, every whispered recollection captured the essence of what had transpired. Across town, a coalition of community leaders and legal advocates began to coalesce around the case. They organized public forums and town hall meetings, inviting residents to share their experiences and to voice their demands for a thorough investigation into police misconduct. At one such gathering held in a repurposed community center, voices once stifled by fear now rang out with passion and determination. Activists spoke of countless incidents that had been swept under the rug, drawing parallels between the day's events and a long history of abuse of power in Riverton. The atmosphere was charged with both righteous anger and hopeful resolve, a collective demand that the truth be brought to light and that those responsible for the injustice be held accountable. Meanwhile, Ariana and Elias Blackwell found themselves at the epicenter of the movement. Their personal ordeal had transformed them into symbols of resistance. Invitations to speak at community rallies and legal workshops began pouring in. Yet, despite the growing support, both knew that the path ahead was fraught with challenges. The authorities had already begun tightening their grip. Behind closed doors, whispers of retaliation and attempts to smear their reputations surfaced. Still, the couple was undeterred. Every day, as they combed through more evidence and liaised with dedicated whistleblowers from within the police department, their resolve only deepened. In a quiet, dimly lit room at the heart of the city's legal district, a team of attorneys, civil rights experts, and investigative journalists gathered around a large table. Stacks of documents, audio files, and video footage lay scattered before them, a mosaic of the incident that painted an irrefutable picture of systemic abuse. Among them was Jasmine Lee, a veteran civil rights lawyer whose reputation for fighting injustice was known far and wide. Jasmine's steely eyes scanned the compiled evidence as she spoke in measured tones. This isn't just a case of one or two officers going rogue. We're looking at a pattern, a system that has long exploited its power to silence dissent and target vulnerable communities. Her words resonated with the group. Plans were set into motion for a comprehensive legal challenge that would not only seek criminal charges against the offending officers but also demand structural reforms within the police department. The coalition agreed that the pursuit of justice required a dual approach, exposing the truth to the public and holding the responsible parties legally accountable. As the evidence continued to mount, state authorities found themselves compelled to act. A formal investigation was launched, with pressure mounting from local officials who could no longer ignore the uproar. Under the scrutiny of national media, key figures within the Riverton Police Department were summoned to answer difficult questions. The once sterile corridors of power began to reverberate with the echoes of accountability. For Ariana, the journey took on an intensely personal dimension. Every time she revisited the footage or read the detailed accounts of the day, a storm of emotions swirled within her, pain, anger, and a resolute commitment to ensure that her suffering would not be in vain. Late at night, in the quiet moments of solitude, she reflected on the path that had brought her to this juncture. The memory of that fateful morning was seared into her consciousness, the piercing gaze of Officer Larson, the predatory smile of Officer Briggs, and the oppressive weight of authority that had sought to crush her spirit. But with each recollection, a fire ignited within her, a fierce determination to transform her pain into a catalyst for change. Elias, too, grappled with the burden of leadership that now rested on his shoulders. His protective instinct had driven him to the streets that day, and in the days that followed, he became an active organizer within the community. Working side by side with activists, Elias coordinated safe routes for protesters and established a network of legal and medical support for those who risked their voices to demand justice. His calm demeanor belied the fierce passion that fueled his every move, a passion born of both love for his wife and an unyielding belief in a better future. As the investigation gathered momentum, courtrooms across Riverton became the arenas where the battle for truth would be fought. The legal team, bolstered by public sentiment and an ever-growing dossier of incontrovertible evidence, prepared to confront the very system that had tried to bury the incident. The trial was not merely a legal proceeding, it was a public reckoning, a moment when the voices of the oppressed would be heard loud and clear, and when the legacy of unchecked power would finally be challenged. Throughout this turbulent period, the community's response remained both spirited and diverse. Vigils were held in remembrance of past injustices, murals sprang up overnight on once blank walls depicting symbols of resistance, and local radio stations hosted roundtable discussions where citizens debated the nature of justice and accountability. Social media platforms buzzed with calls for reform, as hashtags like #RivertonJustice and #TruthForAll trended nationwide. Each post, each shared story, contributed to a growing narrative that demanded not only the punishment of those who had abused their power but also systemic changes that would prevent such abuses in the future. The tension in Riverton was thick enough to be felt in every conversation, every whispered exchange on the city's streets. Yet amidst the clamor, there was also a sense of unity, a realization that the struggle for justice was not confined to any one individual or incident, but was a collective battle against a legacy of systemic oppression. The raw determination of the people, combined with the unyielding pursuit of truth by figures like Maya, Jasmine, and countless unsung heroes, had ignited a movement that was impossible to ignore. In the midst of this maelstrom, the legal proceedings took on an almost symbolic quality. The courtroom became a stage where not only the facts of the case were scrutinized, but where the very ideals of equality, accountability, and human dignity were put on trial. As witnesses stepped forward to recount the events of that day, their voices trembled with both fear and hope. Each testimony was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a declaration that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, the truth would prevail. In the quiet moments before the trial commenced, Ariana and Elias sat together in a small, secluded room behind the courthouse. The space was sparse, the air heavy with anticipation and the silent prayers of those who had fought so hard to see justice done. Elias reached out, grasping Ariana's hand with a tenderness that belied the fierce determination burning in his eyes. "No matter what happens today, remember that your courage has changed everything," he whispered, his voice soft but unwavering. Ariana nodded, her gaze steady, as if drawing strength from the very certainty of their shared conviction. "What do you think will be the most significant challenge that Ariana and her allies will face in the courtroom as they continue their pursuit of justice?" The day of reckoning finally arrived in Riverton. The courthouse, an imposing structure of granite and glass that had long symbolized the authority of the state, now buzzed with a charged energy that was both palpable and hopeful. Crowds gathered outside, their murmurs blending with the soft rustling of autumn leaves, as they waited for the long-anticipated verdict, a decision that would reverberate far beyond the courtroom walls. Inside, the atmosphere was one of intense focus and quiet resolve. The courtroom had been transformed into a battleground for truth, where every word, every gesture, was scrutinized for its weight in the pursuit of justice. Ariana Blackwell, once a target of systemic abuse, now sat poised in the witness box. Her demeanor was calm, yet every line of her face told a story of courage, pain, and the relentless determination to reclaim her dignity. Beside her, Elias Blackwell offered silent, unwavering support, his presence a steady reminder of the personal and collective stakes of this trial. Across from them, a formidable team of attorneys and civil rights advocates presented the case with precision. Led by Jasmine Lee, the legal team meticulously laid out the sequence of events, the incriminating body camera footage, the damning testimonies, and the meticulously preserved digital evidence that Maya Carter had gathered. Each piece of evidence was presented not merely as an isolated fact but as part of a larger narrative of abuse, neglect, and systemic injustice. The prosecution's argument was both powerful and unyielding, calling into question decades of unchecked authority and the mechanisms that had allowed such abuse to flourish. Witness after witness took the stand, their voices trembling at first but growing stronger as they recounted their encounters with the system. A local shopkeeper, a taxi driver, and even a retired officer who had long harbored doubts about the department's practices testified. Their stories, woven together, painted an undeniable picture, a pattern of harassment, discriminatory practices, and deliberate cover-ups that had been hidden behind the polished facade of Riverton's institutions. In one particularly harrowing testimony, a bystander described the moment she had seen Ariana being cornered by officers Larson and Briggs on that fateful morning. Her voice cracked with emotion as she recounted, "I knew then that this was not just about one woman, but about every person who has ever been made to feel less than human by those in power." Her words resonated deeply with everyone present, a stark reminder of the human cost of unchecked authority. As the trial progressed, the defense attempted to challenge the credibility of the evidence and the motivations of the witnesses. They argued that the incident had been misinterpreted and that the officers were simply following protocol. However, the carefully curated presentation of facts left little room for ambiguity. The juxtaposition of the raw, unedited footage with the defense's sanitized narrative served as a powerful counterpoint. Every time the defense's arguments wavered, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the collective hope of a community pressing in for the truth to prevail. Finally, the moment arrived. The judge, a seasoned jurist known for his impartiality and deep commitment to justice, rose to deliver the verdict. His voice, measured yet resolute, echoed through the silent courtroom. After a thorough review of all the evidence and testimonies presented, it is the finding of this court that the actions of officers Larson and Briggs were not only in violation of departmental protocols but also constituted a gross abuse of power and a violation of civil rights. A collective exhale filled the room, a mixture of relief, vindication, and the cautious optimism of those who had fought tirelessly for this moment. The judge continued, "Officer Larson is hereby sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for obstruction, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations, and Officer Briggs to 3 years for willful negligence." These sentences serve not only as punishment but as a declaration that such abuses will no longer be tolerated in our society. For Ariana, the verdict was bittersweet. In that moment, as applause and quiet weeping broke out among those who had gathered in the gallery, she felt both the weight of the past and the promise of a future transformed by accountability. Elias squeezed her hand tightly, sharing a silent vow that the battle for justice was far from over, yet that this victory marked the beginning of a new chapter, a turning point for Riverton and for every community that had ever been silenced. Outside the courthouse, the city of Riverton was alive with a renewed sense of purpose. Banners of solidarity were raised, voices joined in chants for justice, and a cautious optimism began to replace the long-held cynicism. The trial had not erased the scars of the past, but it had shown that when communities come together, when the truth is allowed to speak for itself, change is inevitable. How do you envision the future of Riverton as this new era of accountability takes shape? In the face of injustice, our collective voice remains the most powerful force for change. Today's story is not just about the struggle against oppression, it's about the deep love and resilience that binds us together as a community. Every act of courage, every stand taken against injustice, echoes the timeless truth that love and unity can mend even the deepest wounds. Let this message remind you, when we stand together with hearts full of compassion and determination, no force can silence our call for justice and equality. Thank you for joining us on this journey of truth and transformation. If you believe in a future where love overcomes hate and every voice matters, please subscribe to our channel and be a part of this movement. Subscribe now and stay connected. Together, we create a better tomorrow.